Welcome, everybody. Let's do a roll call.
Chairperson Ferguson.
Present.
Vice Chairperson Bertrand.
Here.
Member Bagwell.
Here.
Member Mayhorn.
Here.
Member Strasburg.
Here.
Quorum is present.
Okay, thank you. Okay, public comments and discussion. The public is invited at this time to comment on and discuss any topic that is relevant or within the authority of the Carson City Audit Committee. In order for members of the public to participate in the committee's consideration of an agenda item, the committee strongly encourages members of the public to comment on the agenda item during the item itself. No action may be taken on a matter raised under public comment unless the item has specifically included in an agenda and as an item upon which action may be taken. Do we have any public comments at this point? Hearing none. Next item for approval is approval of the minutes from February 21st and 28th meetings of the Audit Committee. Do I have a motion for approval?
I move to approve the minutes as submitted for February 21st, 2018 and February 28th, 2018.
All in favor?
I second.
Oh, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Next item for discussion is the adoption of today's agenda. Any comments? Changes?
No changes to the agenda.
Okay. Do we have to approve that then? No? Okay. All right, meeting items. 6A, up for possible discussion and direction to staff regarding the results of the annual audit of the Carson City Comprehensive Annual Financial Report for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2017.
So I'll introduce this. This is Jason Lake, Chief Financial Officer. So this is the presentation that was delivered to the Board of Supervisors back in December of 2017. Due to the scheduling, the Audit Committee had requested the presentation of this, and Dan Carter with Eide Bailey was not available to attend the February meeting, so he is here today to give his presentation to you.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Dan.
Absolutely. For the record, Dan Carter, the external audit partner for the 2017 financial statement audit of the city. We'll run through this pretty quick, and I guys have a long agenda and lots of auditors in the room today, so definitely don't hesitate just to stop me with questions as we go. But like I said, we'll run through this pretty quick. Go through some financial highlights from 2017, and we'll go through summary of audit results, and then discuss just one big GASB that's coming up for next year that the city will need to work through on implementing. So kind of from a government-wide perspective, as if we look at the governmental activities, see kind of a comparison from last year to this year. Blue lines are your assets and deferred outflows of resources. Red lines are your liabilities and deferred inflows of resources, leaving the yellow line with your net position. So you can see assets increased about $10.4 million over the prior year. Liabilities are up about $5.2 million. Assets outpacing liabilities means your net position actually increased $5.2 million from the prior year. From a statement of activities perspective, this is more like your income statement. Again, government-wide, governmental activities perspective. Revenues are up about $5.5 million over the prior year. That's the blue line. Expenses are up $2.7 million over the prior year. Again, leading to the increase in net position, that yellow line. This is revenues by source for the governmental activities. Your top three are property taxes, consolidated taxes, and other taxes, kind of the lower left of that pie chart. That's very, very consistent to prior years. Those are typically the top three. And then expenses by function for governmental activities. Public safety, number one, down there towards the bottom. General government, number two. And then Public Works is number three this year, where Culture and Rec was number three last year. So Public Works beat them out by a little bit. Public Safety and General Government, typically your number one and number two biggest expenses. If we look at the general fund, revenues and expenses, this is the trend over the last 5 years. You can see a good steady increasing. Blue line is your revenues, outpacing your red line of expenses, which is a positive thing. General fund revenues increased about $3 million over prior year, and expenses about $1.3 million. So definitely a good trend there. And if we look at the general fund balance, this is a good chart just to see where your fund balance is sitting. The small bar at the very bottom, the dark blue, is your non-spendable. This is fund balance sitting in items like prepaids or inventory. You're not able to spend those items. They've already been spent. The red lines are restricted. This is externally restricted for grants, statutes, voter-approved items. The blue line is assigned. Those are internal restrictions on fund balance. I think that's primarily due to the subsequent year, making up the subsequent year budget shortfall. And then the green line is your unassigned. That's the fund balance available to be spent out of the general fund. So increasing in all categories over the prior year, definitely a good thing. So if we go back and look at government-wide again, and this is your business type activity, so sewer, water, ambulance, stormwater, cemetery, and building permits. You can see again a good trend of assets increasing about $25.2 million over the prior year. Liabilities increasing 19.1, with the overall increase in that position of about $6.1 million. As it relates to the revenue and expense for the business type activities, again, revenues are up $3.1 million. Expenses are up just about $200,000, leading to that increase in net position. Any questions or comments on financial results? Pretty straightforward. With that, move on to the summary of audit results. So as part of our audit, we issue 3 reports. The independent auditor's report on the basic financial statements, the independent auditor's report on internal control over financial reporting and on compliance and other matters, based on an audit of financial statements performed in accordance with government auditing standards, what we typically refer to as our Yellow Book report, and then independent auditor's report on compliance for each major federal program, and report on internal control over compliance required by uniform guidance. This is the single audit over the city's federal expenditures. So as it relates to our independent auditor's report on the basic financial statements, pleased to report that we did issue an unmodified opinion. That's the highest level of service that we're able to provide in our profession. And I always like to point boards and audit committees to note 2. That's the disclosure about compliance with NRS and NAC. And there were no noted over expenditures at year end reported in the financial statements, which is always a good thing as well. Moving on to the Yellow Book report, we did have 2 material weaknesses that we identified as part of the audit. One related to an overstatement of cash and liabilities of about $559,000. It's a material dollar amount to the audit, so we did report it as a material weakness. And then we also found some incorrect numbers disclosed in the notes to the financial statements and in the RSI related to OPEB, about $1.2 million. So again, given the dollar amount, we reported that as a material weakness. So 2 material weaknesses in relation to the financial statement audit, no significant deficiencies, so no other issues besides those 2.
So that's a material weakness in the controls over cash, correct? Or it's a material difference, but is it a material weakness in controls?
Yes, I mean that's why we report it here. Basically, I think the issue related to a lack of secondary review over those. You've got one person preparing them and no secondary review, so issues slipped through the cracks and it made it into the financial statements when we got them for auditing. Yeah.
Right. Did you, as a result of that, did you kind of like expand any of your tests, to, see if possibly there's more of that happening in that particular area?
As it relates to, so this is kind of in tying out the financial statement numbers and the disclosures. So we do that across the board for the entire CAFR. That's a big piece of what we do. So those were the only 2 issues that we found as part of that process. We check all the notes, all the disclosures, so we didn't find anything else. Yeah.
How did staff respond to the control issue? What was their action? What action has staff taken on that? And was that something that just occurred over the past year, or has that been an ongoing thing? And is it happening in other areas other than the area they caught, because they don't do an extensive look at the internal controls in that particular, just happened to catch that. But I'm wondering, what was your response to that, and is there other problems, and how's that being handled now?
We're going through and evaluating our processes and procedures, and we're going to change some things that we're doing internally within finance before those financial statements are presented for review by the auditors. So there'll be a second set of eyes before they go to the auditors.
So Dan, the overstatement was basically an error on a reconciliation.
Yeah, what happened is those bank account, that particular bank account was actually closed at some point during the year. Sorry. At some point, that bank account was closed during the year. And I think just kind of in a hurry to get final numbers done, the accounting department, someone in there had seen the number and picked up the wrong number off the bank statement. Instead of seeing the zero balance at the end, it's an account that has sat at that same balance for a long time. So saw that same dollar amount and just in her head thought it's the same as always, and left the cash in the GL when really the amount should have been zero. Yeah.
So it's pretty basic. I mean, from a procedural control standpoint, there was probably procedures in place for a secondary review already? Something?
During the transition of the new CFO, we're instituting new procedures related to reviewing those processes.
Yeah, so my understanding is there weren't those procedures in the past, that second check of the reconciliation, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was. She didn't follow, was it not following? Is it an issue of not following, oh, here we go. Is it an issue of not following procedures and missing, or is it a matter of missing a procedure and that we're having to improve the controls? Is there a control there, it just wasn't followed?
Nancy Paulson, Deputy City Manager. What happened was, I think what Dan said is that the accounting manager just picked up the wrong number from the bank statement, picked up the wrong line. And what happens is that's when we're doing a journal entry for all the bank accounts in the city. And so what we normally do is take all the information from the bank statements, put it into an Excel spreadsheet. And because there's so much backup material with the bank statements, we just attach the Excel spreadsheet to the journal entry. So there is a secondary review. However, they're just looking at the spreadsheet and not the original documents. And so I think what they're going to do in the future is just have all the original documents or copies of the bank statements with the journal entry. So that will fix that error. Yeah, it's just going from the bank statement, keying it into the spreadsheet, so.
Okay, thanks.
So moving on to the single audit, and this is our work performed over the city's federal expenditures. We did actually issue a modified opinion on compliance. We had two material weaknesses identified. One, both in the highway planning and construction cluster. One related to some expenditures that we found and couldn't find any sort of evidence of review and approval for those expenditures, which actually led to an issue of expenditures being submitted for reimbursement multiple times. So that's where we got into the question cost amount is they'd been submitted to NDOT and been reimbursed by the feds, and then those same expenses got somehow submitted again, so they were actually paid on twice. So just again, a control issue of lack of review and approval of those amounts before being submitted. And then our other...
Can I ask you a question on that?
Absolutely, yeah.
So the city submitted and was paid twice, so that also means that DOT paid us twice for the same expenditure also.
Yeah.
So, didn't work on
side.
either end of the, they didn't help us and say, hey, you already
Hey,
submitted
this
this.
looks familiar, yeah.
Right.
And,
Could have helped a little. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. And how are we, maybe I can just ask in general, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
Is the grant accounting the most difficult for all local governments, that there's just so many moving parts and so many, is this the area that all the local governments tend to get their findings?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
like you said, a lot of moving parts and a lot of requirements. I mean, a lot of
Right.
compliance requirements that are very specific to the individual programs and, dealing with people who aren't necessarily familiar with those compliance requirements. I mean, they're out there for anyone to see and read and look at in advance of us coming out. I mean, the procedures we do are determined by the feds and they're posted. It's just one more thing for everyone to have to, cross the Ts, dot the Is, and make sure it's done precisely right.
So maybe I can ask staff too a little bit, because the documents are available, and so I don't know if, right, it's really a reminder to pull the procedure out and run through it yourself, and then trade off which grant, or maybe even have one on this grant, check that guy's grant, and this one, check that guy's grant. I don't know, but what do you have in mind to try and eliminate the findings in grants?
That's exactly what we've been discussing, is pulling the CFA checklist, for lack of a better description, that Mr. Carter referenced, and going through and reviewing those for our major programs before the audit in preparation for closeout of the fiscal year.
So let's say I'm just working through my mind on the process. So let's say that DOT example, let's say they found it, in quarter one I drew, and I drew it again in quarter two, because that's what's going to happen. It's going to be an overlapping quarter, but they find it, and the next quarter they then short draw and correct it. So then would that be no finding because it was corrected within the same federal fiscal year grant cycle?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the best case scenario, right?
Oh,
That
good.
the city's
Okay.
internal controls finds the issues, corrects it, and by the time we get out here, the
It's
issue's
clean.
resolved. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Oh, I like that idea then.
Then our second finding over the highway planning construction cluster, again, similar to what we've been talking about. We just found the federal procurement guidelines not being followed precisely, even though the contracts had been reimbursed by federal money. So again, the guidelines are there, the procedures are there. I think it's difficult because it seems like highway planning and construction here deals a lot with NDOT, and NDOT gives them some specific requirements, but they're typically state requirements. So even in those conversations, it doesn't always get to that federal level, which is one extra layer that needs to be complied with when those contracts are being reimbursed with federal money.
So what has staff done to address that? I mean, do we have a procurement, person or two that would make sure we're in compliance with procurement guidelines, whether it's state or federal?
We're developing a review process right now on evaluating how our contracting policies relate to the federal requirements. And so we have some information that we've received from the Nevada Department of Emergency Management that outlines how the three components fit together. And so we're going to be reviewing that in relation to the city's policies.
Okay, thank you.
And then the last piece that we do as part of our audit is follow up on prior findings, make sure corrective action has been taken. There were 3 findings that we reported in the prior year, and we found 2 of the 3 to be corrected. There was one issue in the federal transit cluster that we found to not be corrected, and that's just a lack of evidence of review of federal financial reports prior to submission. Again, just that second set of eyes looking at those things before they go out the door, so. Questions related to that? So real quick, just big new standard implemented for FY18. I believe the city finance staff is working on this already. Right now, your other post-employment benefit obligation is disclosed in the notes to the financial statements, but the full liability doesn't get reported in the balance sheet in the statement of net position, and that'll change for FY18. You've got actuarial accrued liability as of 17 of $63.6 million, offset by about $750,000 of assets sitting in trust. So an additional $62.8 million liability coming on the books next year. Basically, it'll increase the negative net position in the governmental activities, and depending on how it splits out where the numbers fall, it may swing business type into the negative next year. But change in standard, the city does have a trust to accumulate money to offset that liability. But at this point, new big number coming on the balance sheet. So, yeah. Just trying to get OPEB in line with the PERS reporting that we did a couple years ago. Yep, absolutely. And that's all I had, unless there's questions for me.
Any other questions for Dan? Hearing none. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Yep. So do we close that item? Do we have to close that, or are we just moving on? Okay.
We can either give staff direction or not, but I think we had an open discussion with staff on where we were going, and I really think when we get into next year's work plan for the internal auditor, we may wish to dovetail some of the grant area to help them develop the new plan of internal control and what we're going to do to get on the corrective action plan for grants. I think that's where it'll dovetail when we get to the next item on the work plan.
Okay.
I was going to say, as a suggestion, you could add these items, the deficiencies, to your tracking spreadsheet, if you so chose to.
I thought we had that as an automatic.
Yeah.
I believe we have that as an automatic, that anything that comes from the audit goes on to the spreadsheet. That's been our policy from day one. Yeah.
Okay. Next item. 6B, possible action discussion and direction to staff regarding work plan for external auditor in conjunction with the annual audit of the Carson City Comprehensive Annual Financial Report for the fiscal year ended June 30. And we got representatives in to discuss.
Yes, so Ralph Piercy is here. He's going to give a presentation on his work plan for the 2018 audit.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I think I'll sit down because that's kind of long. These for me is kind of let's turn this on. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be of service. We'll strive every day to do a good job for you. Sometimes, you got a lot of auditors involved in what you do, and sometimes it's good to take a minute and focus on what a financial statement audit is. A financial statement audit is a process where the auditor goes about gathering evidence to be able to say the financial statements are fairly presented in all material respects. So what does all material respects mean? We don't audit every transaction, so one of my partners who grew up in rural Nevada explains it using a farming analogy. He says that and when you're doing a financial statement audit, you're more concerned about the existence, the completeness, and the valuation of the haystacks in the barnyard and throughout the field than you are in finding a very small needle at the bottom of one of those haystacks. And so in all material respects, there's this concept of overall, is the financial statement fairly presented? Our goal is to gather that evidence. We may be able to test and rely on the work of Moss Adams. I'm not totally familiar with all the things that they did, but to the extent that we can, we will. And we'll become more familiar with their work as we go along. For example, I noticed that they did an IT review, and they did a review of large public works projects. Those are areas that we might get some help. I think they also did some grant management, internal control testing. Those are areas where we may get some efficiencies by looking at what they did and testing some of their work. We use a risk-based auditing approach. Our firm's been around for 28 years, and for the entire history of the firm, we've used risk-based auditing. That's about 2 decades ahead of when the profession actually required everybody to use risk-based auditing. And the reason why we got a 2-decade jump is because one of the principals in Las Vegas office was the co-author of a risk-based auditing approach that's marketed to other firms in the United States and internationally. And so we've taken that approach that's been around actually quite a while now and adapted it to our own practice aids to make it specifically advantageous to local governments, which we do a lot of local governments, gaming, real estate and construction, and some other industries where we have a lot of expertise. We customize our practice aids so that we can do things efficiently and still be really effective. So we've been using that risk-based auditing approach for a long time. Our risk-based approach starts off by dissecting the financial statements into account balances, transaction types, and related assertions. We identify the assertions such as receivables, are they collectible? Do they exist? Are they collectible? And the relative risk that line item on the financial statement might be misstated. So we do that kind of analysis first, and then once we do that analysis and we've identified the assertions and the risk, we develop a customized work plan to address that. We're not using canned work programs off of somebody's shelf. We're actually thinking, using our head, evaluating what's unique and different about the operations of the city of Carson City and developing specific things to address those risks. While our preliminary work plan is just that, preliminary, it's not completed, let me just take a couple of minutes and identify some of the major things that we will be doing. And I'll use last year's to get an idea of how significant or how many dollars are involved. I'll use last year's numbers, and I'm going to ignore the discretely presented component units. But for example, in cash and investments, that was about $40 million last year. We will agree 100% of the cash and investments balances to the custodian records. We'll recalculate the cost to fair value adjustment for investments and perform a pricing test. We will also test all of the related disclosures. And as you know, if you look through the CAPR, there's a lot of disclosures related to cash and investments. So we do that. Accounts receivable and other receivables, we will be selective on the balances that we confirm, focusing on the bigger balances. By the way, that was about $18 million last year, and revenues were about $130 million. And those revenues and receivables kind of work together, so I'm going to talk about them kind of in the same breath. So we'll selectively confirm some of the balances, and then we'll look at subsequent receipts for a large portion of the difference. And we test, for example, tax revenues with confirmations. We're going to be confirming the amounts that you get with the source of the tax revenues. And for your other revenues, we largely do control testing to make sure the controls are in place, and then substantive analytics. Capital assets, there was about $575 million of capital assets at the end of last year. Most of that balance has been tested in prior year audits. It's not a new thing. It's kind of an accumulation of stuff. And so we'll be testing current year additions. We'll be testing analytically the calculation of depreciation, and we'll most likely be relying on Moss Adams again in that public works area, because I'm sure that a big part of those capital asset additions probably come in that area, although I don't know that for sure. I'm just guessing at this point. Is that probably correct?
We did a process review
Uh-huh.
and a controls review for.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, so and actually, the control testing is also a positive thing for us too, and that will help us balance controls versus substantive testing. Accounts payable and accrued expenses. There's about $8 million last year in accounts payable and accrued expenses, and expenditures were roughly $121 million. We'll select subsequent disbursements to look at in a search for unrecorded liabilities that maybe should have been recorded at the end of the year that hadn't been recorded yet. And we will recalculate some of the major accruals like payroll, compensated absences, that kind of thing. We'll do some recalculation of those accruals. Related to expenditures, we normally do statistical sampling of both expenditures related to general disbursements and payroll. And again, if there's some work that Moss Adams did that would be helpful in our testing of expenditures, we will do that. Those procedures are designed to test for the proper amount of the expenditures, whether or not they're supported by proper documentation, whether the authorizations are appropriate. You got both department and accounting and all the various authorizations that should be there, and also the adherence to whatever your policies are. I mean, everything might have worked great, but it might not have worked exactly the way your policies say that should be done. Bonds payable was about $205 million. And related interest payable was a couple million. Interest expense was about $7 million, and principal payments of roughly $11 million. We'll agree the ending balances and all those debt instruments to the amortization schedules and the debt documents. We'll recalculate the interest expense and accrued interest payable. For any refundings, I understand you may have had one, or you may be contemplating one, or you may be contemplating a new issuance. We again trace all that to the underlying documents and the receipts, making sure you got the money, and recalculate any gain or loss that might occur in that transaction. Net pension liabilities, it was $95 million last year. PERS hires actuaries and other specialists that calculate the city's portion of that liability, and that unfunded pension liability. What we do is we obtain those reports and agree them to the city's statements and the city's records that create that input. We also test the qualifications of the specialists to make sure that they're qualified, and I'm sure they are. When the state hired them, they're probably qualified, but we still test that. And we also test some of the market assumptions. I'll give you an example of that. The state uses an assumed growth rate of 8%. 8% is at the high end of what the range for other governments, it's kind of similar governments do. And so that's an area that we've always monitored and found that the 8% is okay because the returns that the state of Nevada gets is consistently higher than what those other governments have gotten. But so we take a look. We don't just put those reports in our file and say, oh, we did what we're supposed to do. We critically look at them and think. As Dan said, the liability for post-employment benefits is changing this year. Entire liability is going on the books. I didn't have it quantified like he did, but that'll be an area that we test similarly because there are actuaries and other professionals that prepare these reports to determine how much that liability should be, and we treat them just like the professionals that are working with the state of Nevada. Last year, I don't know if Dan brought this up, I think he might have, there was some information on your pension liability that came to light after the CAFR was issued, which will require some of the opening balances to be restated. I don't know the extent of that, but most governments did not restate at the end go back and restate last year. They're going to run the restatement through this year, and that's largely because it's a non-cash kind of restatement. It's more of a geography within the statement's kind of issue, and so I'm assuming we're going to be restating some of those opening balances unless they didn't have a material effect on Carson City for some reason. We, as you know, because of some of the other stuff that Dan reported, the material weaknesses, particularly in the comprehensive audit area, you're not a low-risk auditee, so coverage in the grant area has got to be in the 40% range as opposed to 25% under other circumstances. We're not in a position yet to tell you how many grants that we'll have to look at, but I'm sure we'll have to look at the one that got the material weakness and the qualification from last year, and then whatever else it takes to get to that 40%. Oversimplified, I admit, and so if you know more about it than the average person, don't hit me for kind of glossing over it. But so that's kind of what we have planned, and like I said, to the extent that we can rely on your internal auditors, we will, and we'll try to be as efficient, and we won't be asking management for a soup to nuts list. Our list of things we'll be asking for will be very targeted to the risks that we want to address. That's how we work. Any questions? I also have another principal for my office here, Angela Go. She's the principal in our office that's in charge of our grant compliance practice, and she knows this grant stuff inside and out. And if you have any questions of me or her, we'd be happy to take any answer any questions you might have.
Questions? Just schedule-wise, have you guys worked out, have you set up the test work schedule yet?
Jason and I have talked roughly of schedules. We have talked about early September on the financial statement audit. We haven't really addressed the grant testing. I could spring something on them right now if you want me to. We would like to actually.
He said the earlier the better.
Earlier the better, right? Yeah, we would at least the one grant that we know we have to do. We'd like to accelerate the look at that as early as we can, and we'd like to get a CFA as early as we can so we can kind of plan what other things we need to do. But we're just starting to talk about that, so you can't hold his feet to the fire yet. But.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? That's it. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for
Appreciate the update. Next item, 6C, up for possible action is to accept the approval of the internal audit report and procedures related to the public guardian asset liquidation process and provide recommendations to the Board of Supervisors related to the audit findings.
Hi, everyone. Colleen Rosillas. I'm a senior manager with Moss Adams. If you recall, last year, the city asked us to take a look at the public guardian department, and in particular the asset liquidation process, and identify opportunities for improvements in efficiency and service delivery, as well as a look at controls over the asset liquidation process. When we performed that review, we had 13 recommendations. So we're here a year later to update you on the implementation of those recommendations. And so I'm going to hand it over to Tammy Lohr, who's a senior consultant, who's a lead analyst on this project, to give you that update.
Hi, it's good to be back. So the department has certainly made strides in implementing the 13 recommendations. In addition to providing, an update on those, we'll also talk briefly about the 8 additional recommendations that we identified in our review. So of the 13, 3 recommendations have been completed. So the public guardian now provides quarterly reports to the Board of Supervisors. She also documents the state of assets, and they have secured a storage unit for storing ward assets while they're pending sale. 4 of the recommendations are identified as in progress. Most of these really focus on efficiency and sort of formalizing the practices that are in place in the department. So these were, software system updates, electronic record keeping, developing formal agreements with liquidators, and developing policies and procedures around asset liquidation. And we want to emphasize those policies and procedures. We provided a couple of best practice examples that we could identify in the appendix. You'll notice that the list is not exhaustive. We saw lots of audit reports saying that there should be policies and procedures, but very few good examples of those policies and procedures, so we provided you with what we could. So you're certainly not alone in the lack of policies and procedures in that area. However, given the public guardian's upcoming retirement, it is important to make sure that you get those things written down and retain that institutional knowledge. And unfortunately, 6 of the recommendations we could not determine compliance with. So these were really about the asset processing and liquidation process itself. So stuff like taking an inventory, doing appraisals, making sure that they're issuing receipts and depositing things with the right sort of identification of that receipt number and those kinds of things. So only 1 ward was identified that had any assets sold. The condition of those assets was pretty poor, and so no personal items were salvaged from that. So in order to make sure that, that these things are being followed up on, we would recommend that you guys do another audit in a couple of years to go back and look at those policies and procedures and practices that are in place. And we'll take any questions that you have.
I'm kind of curious, why is it that, or did they give a reason why there wasn't further progress in getting some of these things resolved?
So because there was only 1 ward that had any assets, I think that given the regulatory changes that happened in the last year, they're more focused on that sort of the process rather than focusing on the asset liquidation where there hasn't been a lot of activity. In addition to that, I will say that we noted, that they took steps towards making sure, in those ones that couldn't be determined, they made steps towards making sure that something was in place in the event that something did happen. So they have, a bill of sale book and those kinds of things ready to go. We just couldn't determine actual compliance with the recommendations.
So that's based on the fact that they didn't have
They didn't
personal.
have any
So
assets,
it's not
yeah.
that they
Yeah.
put the components in place, you just can't test that the components worked.
Correct, and
Okay,
they
that's better.
noted that,
Right.
so in the last report, we provided a process map for the asset liquidation process, both, what they were doing currently and our recommendation for that process, and they say that they will follow that, but it's just a matter of following up to verify that.
I think there were 9 wards that came into the Guardian's care this year. Almost all of them were already in a care facility. So in that case, their assets have primarily already been disposed of. When we did the original review, we had many more years to look at. And so there were individuals who had cars and jewelry and, guns to liquidate. So there was more to look at.
So do you see also, because of the new law change, that odds are that's really where we're going to be more in the future, that we're not going to be with the people with assets? We're going to get involved because they get a third-party lawyer now to work on some of that didn't used to be there. So are you seeing that the trend will be we're only going to get the ones already in nursing homes?
So I think in part that was the intent of the law, and there's been a lot of scrutiny, particularly over the public guardian in Clark County. And so that has driven a lot of legislative action here. We'll have to see, that's why we recommend taking at least 2 years before you do another audit to see how it all shakes out. What we've heard so far from the guardian is that the process itself then to have a ward assigned to the guardian is much longer. And so that may also impact what assets are in place once they become part of the care of the guardian.
Well, or that we only refer it to audit when we know we have at least 2 to 3 in the sample. I mean, that could be
Right.
the other issue, right? If they're just at the nursing homes and you still are going to have no sample, it doesn't do any good to refer it. So,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
Real quick, on the asset processing between A and B, when A was the documentation of asset existence and condition, and then B was the inventory of saleable items. And the A was complete. However, B, the inventory of the saleable items was undetermined. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So what we saw was that there was one ward that did have some assets. So we actually saw the photographic evidence of the state of that person's residence. And, you know, we looked at that, and there was also narrative accounts to back up that it was in such poor condition that it wasn't, the goods inside were not salvageable. So the documentation of the state of assets was complete, but the actual inventory was not complete because there was nothing to inventory because it was all needing to be disposed of.
Okay, but on a go-forward basis, the asset existence and the inventory of saleable items is a set process and would, in your opinion, be sufficient?
The documentation of the state of assets, as long as they're taking photographs and, when applicable, providing narrative accounts, then yes, that would be taken care of. Yeah.
Okay.
And retaining that evidence, of course.
One question, what is the plan for these 8 recommendations that you added afterwards? Are these to be added in future audits, or is there anything being implemented with these?
So we would add this to our findings tracking. We'd also anticipate that the board would direct the public guardian to create an implementation plan and implement the recommendations. And then when we go back in a couple of years to check on the status, then we would check these recommendations as well.
So they're already to be included? Yes. Okay, got it.
So any other comments, discussions? Do we have a motion to move forward with the approval and acceptance of the audit?
Okay. I move to accept and approve the internal auditor's report and procedures related to the public guardian's asset liquidation process and recommend that the Board of Supervisors adopt the additional 8 recommendations.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. It's unanimous. Next item is 6D, for possible action to accept and approve the internal audit report and procedures related to the capital projects process and provide recommendations to the Board of Supervisors related to those audit findings. Mark?
Back to Colleen.
Okay.
So if you recall, also last year, we took a look at the small works process within Public Works. So this year, we took a look at larger capital projects. Those are projects that are defined as over $25,000 in value. The purpose of this project was to conduct a review of the capital project development process from project identification through closeout, to identify opportunities to improve efficiency and also to identify controls in the process. Public Works manages not just Public Works projects, but all capital projects for the city, and that's a typical format. So what we did for this project was we worked with Public Works to document the current process, and we tested documentation for each step in the process to determine whether the city was compliant with what their process was. We also made recommendations for improving the process, both to align it with best practice and also to improve efficiency and controls. So first, as usual in our reports, we try to add in some commendations. Public Works staff are really great to work with. They're really generous with their time and really open with their documentation. And as auditors, that makes our job very easy. So we want to make sure that we give them some credit there. They also already do many things according to best practice, which is good to see. They use a cloud-based project management tool, and they really do use that tool to its fullest extent. We put it up on a screen and walked through a project with them, and that was very good to see. We have clients that have a lot more resources in their public works departments who are not that sophisticated with project management. And they're also pretty well organized in terms of their documentation, which again makes it really easy for us to do our jobs. So for this project, we had 8 recommendations. I'll approach them for you in 3 categories. The first is, we had 3 recommendations that we would call operational, just to make the process more efficient. So use electronic signatures. The signature process we identified takes about 2 weeks here. Most of the documents don't need wet signatures, so let's get with the 21st century there. Making sure we use a single project identification number so we can better track documentation. And then for some of the areas of documentation, very clearly defining what those documentation requirements are so they're in the right place. That's in particular related to some of the contract documents. And then with respect to risk, we had one process that we identified that really needs to be revamped for controls and risk to the city, and that's accounting for staff time on capital projects. So that's done on a spreadsheet. It's a highly manual process for both Public Works and Finance, and at the end of the day relies on journal entries. So we recommend that Public Works and Finance get together and figure out a way to automate that so that we can adequately account for staff time on capital projects. And then the third category, we've got 4 recommendations that are kind of policy or governance level recommendations to bring the city more in line with best practice. So I'll walk through those. The first is that the city's capital project planning process is a consensus-based process. It seems to work well for the city. I think we've probably all been in meetings, though, where we know that consensus might not be the most efficient way to do things, especially in a revenue-constrained environment. We recommend, and this is really best practice in capital project planning, for the city to adopt a scorecard for capital projects so that when they are proposed, they're assessed in a consistent manner. And then that way we can use that to start the process. Similarly, related to that, we think that the city should do lessons learned processes at the end of projects so that they're able to identify where we performed well and where we could improve the capital project process. We also recommend expanding the project management manual to cover all types of projects, to cover more steps in the process in more detail. In particular, the closeout procedures. Closeout can take a long time on big projects like this, and so that tends to be an area where things can get bogged down and we'll have projects open for a long time, which impacts finance and other departments as well. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
First question I had was on the time tracking. You said they were using a project management software package, but then they were using an Excel spreadsheet for actually tracking time. Most project software packages that I'm familiar with have time tracking capabilities built into them because inherently anybody working on a project has to track their time towards that project because, one, it's either billable or they're capitalizing the expense associated with it. So there's usually pretty stringent functionality built into the software to help track time. Just curious.
Yeah, so the current process is that staff enter their time in the payroll system, and they use specific codes for projects, and then that's pulled out into a spreadsheet that then is used to do the journal entry accounting to transfer the funds on the finance side. So the payroll system and project management software don't talk to each other. and all of the staff only enter their time once in payroll, and then other financial staff in both Public Works and Finance do the back-end work to make the accounting work for the projects.
So the actual time that they're coding to the project, is it put into the project software, project management software?
The spreadsheets are kept in the project management software, but the software itself does not track time.
Okay, so then at the, at the end of the pay period or the month, somebody's going back in from either in a payroll or accounting and saying, okay, total payroll was X, here's the number of hours that go towards this project, and somebody's manually reclassing it?
Yeah, that happens in Public Works Finance, yes.
Okay, thanks.
But how does so if the payroll system is separate, how does it actually get recorded in the project versus you just have to pull it out of the financial to see that it was coded to the project?
So it's recorded in the project in the city's financial system through a journal entry process.
Right. No, but how does, go a different way. I want to know all the expenses for XYZ project. Do I have to do a manual pull then from the city's finance side to say, here's the staff time, the direct staff time to that project? I can't go to a project software and get that. You're saying I have to utilize two systems to
Yes.
accomplish it
Yes.
currently. Are we going to, is that fixing in our new system?
Yes, when we adopt the new ERP system, there will be a direct connection between project entry and the general ledger.
So does that mean that the employee will be recording their time then on the project itself, and that will pull it?
Correct.
To the-
So at the
that'll be
time
good.
entry level,
Right.
we'll enter the time into the project code, and then the software will then make an appropriate allocation for the fully loaded
charge
cost
it.
to the project.
Good.
I just wanted to add that they do a journal entry to move the payroll into the projects, and you can actually run a report out of the accounting system that is by project number. So it is tracked that way.
Another question, within the scope of the audit, was any, I mean, we had issues with the grants identified in the external annual audit. Was there any provisions in the scope of this review looking at either federal or state reimbursements for grants?
So this was really focused on how we administered the project and delivered the project at a higher level than perhaps looking at the specific expenditures for specific grants. We are currently conducting a grants management internal controls review and testing.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? It's good to hear good favorable feedback on the transparency and cooperation from the department, so that's great. It's good news overall. I mean, things look pretty, compared to other cities that you audit on the capital project side, how would you assess Carson?
Yeah, I have been doing capital project related policy and process consulting for probably about 15 years. And we came in on the first day and we had all the people involved in the same room and whiteboarded the whole process. And there were several times, I think Tammy can attest, that I said things like, I am thrilled, because they were doing things for the most part really in the right way, really by the book, which is really good to see.
Good, thank you. Do I have a motion to, if there's no other comments or discussion, anybody? Motion to accept this and move forward with presentation to the Board of Supervisors?
I move to the motion to accept the auditor's recommendation on the capital projects process and provide those recommendations to the Board of Supervisors related to the audit findings.
I'll second the motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Next item, 6E, up for possible action, discussion and direction to staff regarding the current audit work program update.
Okay. That's me, Mark Steranka, Moss Adams.
You came for.
Yeah, exactly. So quick status, so again, you should have just a little two-page status report. So the three projects that we had active prior to this meeting were the large public works that you just heard about, the public guardian follow-up, and then Colleen just mentioned the grants management internal controls testing, which we're in the throes of, and hopefully we'll be presenting that at our next meeting, assuming we have a meeting in June. In terms of budget, everything's within budget, as it always is. No news there. Ethics hotline, there were 2 reports since we last met. Both were referred to others within, both had to do with the city. One was regarding potential misuse or concerns about use of city vehicles, and so that was looked into. And then the other one was I'll say potential theft of property, which the sheriff's office looked into and found was unfounded. I would just mention here, as I did for one of our other clients, whenever the reports have to do with the sheriff's office or the chief of police and others, they are the most responsive. I mean, I get them, I get the emails back at midnight saying we're on it, and they're on it. So, gotta give them props for that. I think that was it. I know what I wanted to mention. It's audit findings tracking. So we did not bring that to you today, just because we knew you had a long list. We didn't know we'd be a little tight on time, but so that was a little fortuitous. But we'll definitely bring that back, and we'll have from the CAFR, the single audit, and public guardian added at that point. Any questions?
So the only future activity would be related to the grants management. Everything else is closed.
That is correct, yes. Thank you. Yep.
We don't need an action on that, on the updates, so.
I think just move to accept or whatever.
I don't think we
We
need
don't need any action.
Yeah.
Report.
Thanks, Mark. 6F, for possible action, discussion, and possible action to identify and discuss, provide recommendations to the Board of Supervisors on projects to be performed by the internal auditor for the period ending June 30th, 2019. And I think we were going to, well, we chatted a little bit about this, perhaps an update to risk assessment matrix that was done in 2012 could be a good baseline to start, so that we, with the limited budget we've got of $110,000, we want to make sure that we're auditing the most risky and potential areas that we see are most valuable to the city. So updating that audit matrix may be helpful.
Agreed, and just so you know, you should have in your packet, thank you, sorry, a little slide deck entitled FY 18-19 Internal Audit Program. Looks like you have it. I'm not going to walk you through all that. I was just pointing that out for 2 reasons. One is just a reminder that, each fiscal year we try to cover as best we can a variety of type of projects. So as Steve just mentioned, projects that are addressing reduction of risks, projects that are strengthening controls in compliance related to that, and then projects that are focusing on efficiency and effectiveness. And so you have in here just a list on pages, what are they, 5, 6, 7 are the prior projects, just so you have those as reference. And then on page 8 is a list of potential projects. And so what we want to do this year was be a little bit more diligent in having this be a two-meeting discussion or two-meeting topic. So today is just intended to discuss potential projects, and then we'll come back next meeting as we've with either a narrowed list or dollars associated with that. But you've already had some good discussion this meeting of things that you're interested in, and so that again was just the intent of today to sort of get the discussion going. So if you look on your page 8 or slide 8 entitled FY 18-19 Internal Audit Plan Potential Projects, you'll see the risk assessment there, number one. Mainly because I would say we're overdue to do that. The only thing, though, I would just say is projects that we're working on are actually still based on the risk assessment and the internal controls review. So those tend to be foundational and give you multiple years of projects. But yes, we do want to update, and we should do that this next fiscal year. The second project, AR internal controls testing, so that's one of the areas of internal controls that we have not tested yet, and so it would make sense to do something there potentially next year. Contract review, I know there's been some conversation about contracts. We've dealt with large and small public works, but not professional services contracts. So that's certainly an area that we could look at. Policy, procedure, compliance, how do we make decisions about procuring those services? The fire overtime study, I know that's had a little bit of airtime recently. We would coincidentally mention that we have done an overtime study for your chief at a different location, so it wouldn't be foreign to him or us. I think he would probably embrace it, but not to speak for him. Sorry. IT security, I placed that on the list. We've talked about it before. There's been interest. Whether the city gets off the state sort of platform or not, I would submit there's enough challenges within IT security to still do something meaningful there. Now, we're not going to be able to do all of these, so but I'm just running through these. Asset management, Jason, is there going to be a presentation on? Yeah.
The next agenda item is a presentation.
Perfect. And just the reason that was on there, that was one of the areas of moderate to high risk from the 2012 risk assessment. Now, we might find from the presentation that we're all good here, but it's here for but it's here for the reason of we are still referring back to the risk assessment and the internal controls review. And then the last three are just kind of our I'll call our ongoing items, although I'll probably recommend a slightly reconfigured budget for those just based on how we're historically using them, using the dollars. So where we haven't spent as much, let's not allocate as much there, for example. So anyway, so those were our thoughts in terms of potential projects. We did get some input from the city manager's office. We did get some input from some of the audit committee members, but mainly this was so that we can have a discussion now. You can be thinking about it between now and the next meeting, and then we can make decisions versus doing it all in one shot, which is what we've done previously. This is a little bit more prudent.
Yeah, I'm just kind of want an estimate based on the scope of each of these items here, what the budget would be on each of these, so that when we do come back, we can kind of like prioritize, which is,
So just to make it easy for you, so items 1 through 6, just say on average, 25K. I mean, I did a little scribbling, some are more, one is less, but 25 to 30K. So you're probably only going to be able to do 4, And we can do a little scoping, to make sure, which we do each year to, fit as much as we can within the budget. But that's usually the range we're in, is about 4 projects a year.
So for the IT security, though, I'm wondering if that would be like a little, I guess in light of possibly getting off on the state system, maybe that should be a smaller study, or, that'd be next year, so.
Okay, well,
that'd be something we can talk about. I guess I'm thinking there'll be some changes, so maybe that's not a high priority compared to some of the things. Because I know we've talked about that, but risk assessment, I think, is really important.
Definitely.
You know, that's the overall. And contracts review and fire study, just because there's some, I think part of what we're doing here is when we do hear of something coming up, that's what this committee is for, to kind of go there and find out there's a problem. So we're looking at the big picture, looking for where there could be risk and things, we go for it at the same time. Where something does come to our attention, go for it. So I just, I guess it sounds like from what I've been hearing here, we got number 1, number 3, and number 4 meet those requirements. So so I think 1, 3, and 4 is ones I would probably see as a priority right now.
Yeah, and I don't think we're making a formal decision today, right? So it's really just discussion. And I mean, from my perspective, 3 and 4, the contracts and the fire overtime. Overtime's not only fire department issue, but across the city. So it's not. And both of these, the reality is, if your internal control structure is adequate, these things should have been nipped in the bud. It's reporting and adequate review of making sure that we're within budget on overtime, and contracts are reviewed, setting up an adequate control structure. And I don't know what that dollar amount is, but maybe it's something that staff and the city needs to evaluate as far as what's the threshold. If we have an individual contractor who's above 25,000, above 50,000, what's the amount where we need additional sign-offs? To make sure that we're in compliance, following our own policies as to who we're going to, employ at given rates. So, to me, that goes back to internal control structure and assessment. And overtime reporting. I don't know if the city, this is example. At several employers, I used to get an overtime report every Monday morning sent into my email box that showed every department, every location, and the amount of overtime that they had. And it's pretty simple. It's transparent. It came into the CFO. It went to the CEO. It went to HR. So everybody was on the same page as far as the amount of overtime that we were incurring. And it was a transparency thing. And as soon as you saw, why has this department got 50 hours overtime last week? And then the questions get raised from that. So just allowing that, transparency and reporting might be helpful. And I'm not sure what practices we have in place right now for overtime, but I don't want to get into a in-depth discussion on it. Just kind of pointing out that, to me, they're internal control structure issues. So looking at these 2 specific areas, there's probably overlying issues across the departments and functions where we could be making better assessments on our internal control structure and making sure that our policies are followed.
Is there a reason that we're concentrating specifically on fire? Yeah, okay, yeah, that's.
Public safety, yeah. Yeah. And right, and to, I'll say, be fair, there are a number of considerations that go into overtime, especially in public safety. Staffing levels, people on leave for various reasons, intended use of overtime, which is part and parcel to it. So it's a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle to put together, and often it's doing a staffing study, not something that we would do, but periodically looking at what shifts they use and overlap and things like that. So it's one of the more complex areas relative to overtime.
Mark, what input did you get from staff and city manager's office? And
so I shared this list with them, so they had a chance to review, and really I was looking for anything that would be significant additions. So they've had a chance to mull this over also.
Jason, I'm curious. You've been on board for 6 or 7 months now. Enough to enough to be dangerous? Just curious. Coming in, and again, this goes back to my experience as a CFO. When you come into a new job, you're constantly assessing, how things are working, and based on having 6-7 months in, is there any areas that you feel warrant a review to help sure that we're get our I's dotted and T's crossed from a policies, procedures, compliance standpoint?
Given that we're going to be implementing a new ERP system, we suggested not doing a heavy internal control review related to financial transactions because we're probably going to be rewriting most of those over the next 2 years with a new system. So that was our suggestion. But there may be opportunities to document the efficiency change from the old system to the new system that we may want to consider doing.
And
Just to follow up for Jason, just
Oh,
curious,
go
are
ahead.
there any areas or departments where you have, I'm sorry, I thought my mic was on. Are there any areas or departments where you have concerns just being new? You're thinking, this doesn't, it seems like it would be due for a review, or I'd like to, as a CFO, as a sitting CFO, I'd like these areas to be reviewed. Is there anything that's kind of come to your attention over your tenure thus far?
One of the things that we've been, and it's been discussed here as well, is the contracting policies, that we need to have a coherent strategy that incorporates both federal, state, and our own municipal processes as well. And so we've been talking Public Works and Finance on what that might look like, but we'll need to bring the city manager's office into that because that's essentially a city manager policy and procedure now.
Got it. Thank you. Lori, did you have?
One other note is that I know we are going to have, the city's going to have a new ERP, but in my experience, it often behooves if you look at the processes first and simplify and take care of internal controls at the process level, and then have the technology kind of enhance that process. So just a thought for you to kind of consider.
Thank you.
So my question really goes into, we're currently doing grant, but is that the transactional piece versus the compliance that would help us eliminate what we keep getting hit on in the external audits? And so I want to make sure that I want to move us to a low-risk audit, right? That's one of our goals. I don't want a 40% coverage. I want to get down to the 25%. And so does the current audit you're working on going to develop those samples for them or methodologies, or you're really just doing transactional and we need to add on to this one the grant compliance piece that they would review?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So, yeah, I would say our focus more is on the transactional, so we're looking for exceptions. But what I would suggest is, I think it's important for us to be able to deliver that report next meeting, have that before we have the discussion of the program, and then you can have the benefit of that and say, see how much of, you feel like that addressed what you might want looked at, and then we can build from there.
One of the other areas for me is to really have an efficiency or effectiveness discussion on even the use. So we have a lot of part-time employees, we have a lot of contract employees, we just have a whole myriad of methodologies, and I don't know if we have a good documented review process that we're going to do every so often to say, should we add an employee? Should we change the rate of pay? Should we, just looking across the whole personnel side of issues. I think at some point, and maybe that comes up on the risk assessment in year 2 or 3, but I'm interested in looking in that arena also.
I don't think that we have good policies and procedures in place in relation to those decisions and documentation. So I would suggest before we engage the internal auditor to look at that maybe city staff develops policies for that. And so that would be my suggestion prior to engaging the internal auditor for that.
That you don't want the help on the front end, you want the help on the back end? Okay, thanks.
And Lori, if you want to go back just for some light bedtime reading, in 2014, the employee efficiency study that we conducted, we did go into the use of part-time, the use of contract staff, and that was a department-by-department assessment. So you may get some information there. That's obviously 4 years old, but there was some information there on current practice related to that.
I think before we leave this, as we're looking at projects for the next year, I guess my question is, are there any other projects that are probably not listed here that anybody would be interested in seeing worked on, or is this pretty comprehensive for what's on our radar? Yeah, okay. You know, I feel good about it, just.
The only, and I wasn't here for that part of the review, but the cash review that was done in 2014, there were enough findings with that review that might be something that we revisit, because I know we had open issues, up through last year from that cash audit. But since the audit, if the audit program is still reasonably applicable, it could be something that was, fairly quick review, because it would basically be going in and using the old audit program to retest some of the cash control issues that we encountered in 2014. I don't know, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I was here when that happened, and I agree with that. I think that's one of the things that we do like to do, is at times go back and do like a quick little test and, revisit, especially some of the areas that had a lot of recommendations and comments, and see how they're doing. So maybe it may not only be cash, there might be some other areas too that we need to kind of, I'm trying to think. Didn't we have a problem with Public Works at one time with, was it Public Works?
I think that one was already a validate. Some of them, we already had them do validations. And the reason the cash was held open is the treasurer had indicated she put together a training and it hadn't happened yet. So that's why it looked like it was open. And then remember, she did it last June, May and June, throughout the departments, and she even showed it to us. She came and did that. So that's why that one was hanging out, because all of the different departments had to clean up each of their procedures to come into compliance with the new cash handling. So I think it did. Not that you can't always check again, but I'm saying, I believe they did some validations that the safes were put in, we now have somebody picking up the cash, blah, 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 blah.
So I guess there's a difference between validation and going back and auditing again. So the validations are a little on the near afterwards, but an audit is maybe a few years later and going back and seeing what's happening. So
There's no slip.
yeah, so I guess maybe putting something in there, and maybe that'd be a low budget, because it wouldn't be anything intensive. It's just a matter of spot checking some of the areas to highlight, and that'd probably be a good practice for us to do. Keep on top of every year, maybe taking a look at some of those things, that go back and revisit some of those problem areas from a few years back. And it would be interesting to then see, how does that compare? Is there any change? Is it a good, or is it gotten worse? So yeah, if you could put that on there, I think that would be something with a budget attached to that.
Maybe we can make a change to our tracking sheet that has some of those old projects on there that we can go back to if we need to, or at least to have.
That's it.
Yeah, the historic side,
Yeah.
yeah.
We just need to get it as the spreadsheet itself, so we can get to the historic tab.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Rather than getting this, I think it's good just having a summary. What were some of the projects we've done over the last few years? It's like we've done here, exactly. Yeah.
Honestly, I think since the risk assessment hasn't been updated for coming up on 6 years now, a risk assessment may really tip us off to things that we should focus in on. And maybe it may be cash because of the number of recommendations we had in the cash, audit 4 years ago. Maybe, that moves up on the risk assessment because, it's that risky of an issue. So, do we have time or budget money to do a risk assessment before the end of the fiscal year?
Sorry. We do have some money left. I'm sure we'll come in under budget on the validation, I think I want to say, but I don't think we're going to have enough to do the risk assessment. I mean, we could, if we were in essence kind of straddling the year, we could. I mean, we could start it and finish it and take advantage of the funds that way. But
I was just thinking off the top of my head, because I think it would help, drive our audit program, and it's something that I think we should think about every year, January, February timeframe, update the risk assessment so that we know what's going to kind of bubble to the top for audit programs, for the subsequent year. It'll help if we update that risk assessment. And if you update it annually, it's a lot easier because you can remember what happened in the last year that changed on the risk assessment matrix. So, just something to consider.
You'll see when you look at it, it's not really your average risk assessment. It's pretty comprehensive.
Okay.
So, it's not kind of a checklist matrix. Now, that doesn't mean we can't do that. I'm just saying we wouldn't want to do what we do every year. And that's why it's able to give us kind of a multi-year purview, because it's pretty comprehensive. But anyway, I don't disagree with what you're saying. But if you could get your CFO to carry some dollars to next fiscal year, then from this fiscal year, then you have a little bit more to work with.
One other comment is on after we relook at some of us weren't around, so after we look at the risk assessment, will there be opportunities that maybe some of the areas could be assigned to an internal audit program and others could be more of a self-assessment?
Sure. And so like spot checking was brought up. So most of the cities we work with, cities and counties, there kind of is that sort of some form of distribution of activities where finance and accounting is doing some amount of that sort of just on an ongoing basis. And it's, kind of more the spot checking, and then internal audit kind of does, the little bit larger scale stuff. So yes, that's possible, but that's not for me to answer. That's for Jason to answer.
Yeah. As we're talking about this, there's probably another category in here, because if we find something, we've in the past had almost like a contingency category. So we might have some dollars, because as we get into this, we might want to have some dollars, kind of like we did this time, that we're saying, this has come up as a result of risk assessment, and if we have everything budgeted out for the year, we can't touch it for another year. So probably where maybe that budget could be where we were talked about going back and looking, spot checking some of the cash, but also that could be part of that too. So I guess I'd like to see some kind of a contingency on there.
Okay. And for the sake of time, we're going to talk about this at the next meeting. So
Decide.
it was good discussion. Appreciate everybody's input. So with that, we don't have an action out of this item at this point. Thank you, Moss Adams.
Thank you.
The next item is a presentation to inform the audit committee of the progress of the Carson City's asset management program. And we look forward to hearing about this.
Good afternoon. While we bring up our presentation, I'll just start with some introductions. My name is Stephanie Hicks, and I'm the real property manager for Carson City. I'm joined by Matthew Lawton, who is our asset manager. Matt and I both work for the Public Works Department. Dan Stuckey is the city engineer and our supervisor. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here tonight. But the presentation that we're about to give you is a presentation we gave to the Board of Supervisors in March for an annual update on our asset management program.
Thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Almost there.
We're almost there. As a way of just a little bit of background, this was our second annual report to the board. So in 2 years, we have really made some significant progress in our asset management program. Our presentation really won't go back too far into our first year, but certainly if you have any questions about where we started, we'd be glad at a future date to talk to any of you, individually and answer any questions that you have. Matt and I both joined the city about 2 years ago, and the program had just been initiated, so it's been exciting to be able to be part of this. While we were here listening to the meeting, there's been a lot of discussion about assets. That's what you guys are here to talk about. But for purposes of our program, asset management really is based on infrastructure asset management. So what we've been looking at over the last couple of years is our building facilities, water, sewer, stormwater, parks, landfill, streets, and that has been the focus of our program thus far. What really our implementation strategies have focused on is developing a proactive maintenance and planning strategy so that we can minimize the risk and maximize the effective useful life of our city assets. And that will optimize customer service, but also promote data-driven decisions and increase transparency. So one of the first things that we did as we embarked on the asset management program is we took a look at what our main goals would be, and we have them listed here in this slide. And we've been working on our actual inventory and also our condition assessments. And we're moving into using that information for our capital improvement planning and also looking for other funding mechanisms that we can then incorporate into our CIP and our annual process. That will help us with maintenance and reporting. And really, one of the things that we've come to realize in this is that this is really a cycle. It's something that is going to be ongoing. We have goals and objectives for the next 5 years, an implementation plan Matt will go into for the next 5 years, but really we see that we're going to just continue to revisit these things. The overall goal of what we're looking at is out 20, 30 years, so a lot of this will just be a continual process that we'll be doing. In 2017, we used a Smartsheet software to implement a condition assessment of all of our building facilities. So prior to this, there was not an inventory system for the community center or any of our other buildings. So our facilities staff spent a lot of time. They went out, they collected information and data. We were able to incorporate it into a very cost-efficient and effective software that was easy for them to use and implement. And this has kind of been the foundation of our facility condition assessments, which we're going to continue to build on and grow. Over the last year, we continued that with quarterly review. And we're also, one of our objectives is this should be something that's part of our standard work practice, our day-to-day functions. It shouldn't be something that we're doing after the fact. If we go out on a work order at a building and we identify and recognize that there's a need or that something has changed, we should be documenting it as part of our daily processes so that we can use it in our daily decision-making as well.
Okay, real quick, was there an asset tracking program before, or?
From a financial aspect, there was, but not really from the maintenance aspect. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now is it a new software that was brought in that handles both the tracking and the condition assessment or condition tracking?
The software, it's called Smartsheet, and actually it's the same software we were talking about earlier for the capital improvement projects. It's an enhanced spreadsheet, really, and it has project management capabilities. It has some great abilities to pull in photos, send out emails, but it's not a real robust facilities maintenance program or even project management program. It is a cost-efficient software that we were able to bring in and implement efficiently and quickly and train up people on in a short period of time. So it's kind of, while it's the basis to a lot of things, we see it as a stepping stone to what we would like to get to in the coming years that will be more of a robust asset management system.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. One of the other things that we implemented last year was we transitioned from the work order system in our HTE system to using Request Tracker, which is the system that our information technology uses for help tickets. We made that transition with our building maintenance because it is again, a system we already had, didn't cost us anything to implement, but it provided us much more functionality than what we were using in HTE. So essentially, we went from a system that the facilities manager would print out the work orders at the beginning of the day, and he'd hand them out to everybody, and if new work orders came in later in the day when they caught up with each other, he'd hand them out to everybody, to a system that now they're accessing on their iPads and on their iPhones. So they're able to get those work orders out in the field, makes their work much more efficient because there might be something that comes in while they're actually at the building that they were already working on. But it also gives us a reporting system that we use through Power BI. And so the example I have up there is a dashboard system that we are able to utilize. We're able to select any given time frame. This information right now is available since June of last year when we implemented the software, and we're able to look at the number of tickets or work orders that have been opened for what different facilities, but also be able to break those down and look at them also by task. So we could, in this slide, we individually selected a building. I think this one was City Hall. We were able to see that there were 22 work orders within that time frame. It also allowed us to see the number of hours our staff worked on those work orders, and it also breaks them down by tasks below. And then further, we can also use the reporting to just look at, what our staff is doing and what hours they're spending as well. So it really has become a powerful tool that we've used for several things. One of the things just recently we looked at was how much time we're spending on heating and HVAC calls because of the, changes with our energy efficiency. And we're able to pull up that information and see real time how much staff time are we spending responding to these sorts of calls. We've also used it to see how much time we're spending on building maintenance in particular areas. So it has been a very useful tool. To pull that information out of HTE really almost had to become a manual process to re-enter it into something that was usable. But again, we see this as a stepping stone from where the new ERP will take us, and that will give us even more functionality in the future. And I think the most exciting part is, we have taken this, staff has really embraced it. Ron Reed, our facilities manager, and Tyler Saylor with IT really helped us implement this. They championed this. And we went from a staff that really didn't do much more than logging onto their emails in the morning to being, robust users of their iPads and collecting information out in the field. And that's the direction that, we think it's important for us to go. We are also, this next year, going to update our roof assessment. So in 2016, a company that we use called Garland went out and assessed all of our buildings' roofs. They provide us a very detailed inspection report. It lets us know the date of their inspection, what type of materials the roof is made of. They also take photos so that we have all that information in our report. And most importantly, they provide us some solution options. So they, looking at the condition of the roof, they're able to tell us what's the useful life left on the roof, what sort of repairs are needed, and what kind of costs those
repairs are going to be. This year, we're going to take it a little bit further, and what we're asking them to do is we have identified that there are some problem areas where we have leaks when we have frequent rain events, and we've had those more recently. So they're going to look at our buildings that have wood substructure roofs, and they have the ability to do some troubleshooting for us. And so we're going to implement a couple of different ways of investigating it. If they're able to get into the roof from underneath, they'll do that. But they also are going to come out and they're going to do some thermal scanning of the roof, and that will allow us to see if there's any moisture, and that could indicate that there is a problem elsewhere. So this we see as a real benefit to us. The best part is it's already under our contract with Garland, so for them to do this initial assessment, it's not going to cost us any additional money. In 2017, we did inventory the park facilities and assist them in creating a smart sheet database. So the parks are going to be coming online with this same software. And our objective for 2018 is that they're going to then go back and complete their initial condition assessment for all of the park facilities as well. So again, it's just going to provide us that first critical component, actually the first two, our inventory and our condition assessments for our asset management program. We also were tasked last year to initiate a reserve study for our general fund asset systems. And last year we did research firms and we spent some time talking about the types of scopes of services they could provide us. There are several firms that can come in and they bring professional engineers to come in and in great detail look at all of the building components. So what we did with our condition assessments through Smartsheet really is an initial review. What they'll do is they'll come in and do a much more thorough analysis, and then they help us project that out over 20 to 30 years, and that will help us identify what our funding needs are. We have gotten some initial cost estimates from $150,000 to $250,000 for those, and our objective for this next year was to initiate that through an RFP process. Unfortunately, we didn't get that funding in this year's budget, so that's going to put us a little behind on it, but we'll still continue to move forward and capture the information through the condition assessment that we currently have. But overall, what our goal with that reserve study is we want to see this transition from reactive maintenance to preventative maintenance. And really, in order to do that, we need to know what that sustainable funding level is. Where is that delta, that difference between, just going out and reacting to things, then getting ahead of those and going out and doing some preventative maintenance so that in the long run, the costs are reduced. And that is what the reserve study will assist us to do.
Hey, Stephanie, real quick, just from a time check standpoint, we got about 5 minutes left.
Okay, all right.
For your
Okay. Thank you.
Just in time for my part. Good afternoon, Matt Lawton, Asset Manager for Public Works, and I will try to be quick. I just wanted to highlight a few more areas beyond facilities, some infrastructure areas where we've made some headway with asset management over the last 18 months or so. One is our sanitary sewer system. We completed a master plan update last year for sanitary sewer, and that really helped in the process of identifying and prioritizing our CIPs for that system. And it also laid out some documentation for inspection and condition assessment for the city to pursue. Many of these objectives that we've laid out for the next year have already been accomplished within the sanitary sewer sector. We have a new CCTV van on board. That's the video cameras of the pipes to actually get the condition of the pipes, whether they're crumbling in areas or collapsed or whatever the condition may be. So that's actually out being used at this time. We have also trained our city staff in standardized methods of doing that assessment. We've issued the RFP and actually selected a consultant to help us supplement the city staff so that they can go out and hit areas that we haven't always had our crews go out and record. So there's an estimate of about 5 to 7 years to get the complete system cameraed and really get a very solid condition assessment of that whole sanitary sewer pipeline infrastructure. The stormwater system, we're still in the asset inventory phase with the stormwater. There's a lot of stuff that's been done with the stormwater system over the years that never got integrated with our GIS system. So last year we had one of our GIS on-call consultants do a pilot project of putting some of the infrastructure in from old paper maps, talking with our stormwater engineer to build up our asset inventory. So this year they've proceeded to build out the inventory in GIS. The pink or red highlighted areas is the areas that they're focusing on right now. And then after the beginning of the next fiscal year, they're going to focus on kind of the orangish and then hopefully get to the yellow areas so that we can have that inventory completed by the end of 2019 within GIS. Transportation, we get a what's called a pavement condition index done, I think, every year. Our transportation manager was here, but she just stepped out. But what this does is it gives us an idea of the conditions of our streets. There's some limitations. This van drives around. They have a laser that is able to determine how many cracks there are per foot on the roads, and the information that's provided from that gives an overall score of the condition of the pavement. I've been working with our transportation group to try and integrate that more with GIS. Right now it's in a program called MicroPaver, so we're trying to make a better connection with GIS so we can do a more robust asset management analysis of that PCI data. Stephanie and I have also been working with them on street ownership mapping updates. Stephanie does a lot of work with right-of-way documentation, getting that stuff nailed down. So we're trying to reflect all that to be current, accurate, and comprehensive within GIS. And then there's also a need to really do a comprehensive sign inventory for the city. This is something that's on our radar as well for this year, is to provide a tool that's GIS-driven to be able to do that and also do some condition assessment for those signs. So this is a slide that's been around for a couple of years. This was the asset management program timeline that was created. And I think we're right in the ballpark of where we plan to be. The asset inventory, obviously that timeline there ends around this time period right now, mid-2018. And that doesn't mean that we have every single asset cataloged in GIS or another database, but we've built the processes for capturing that information, especially for the utility infrastructure. When projects close, we get the construction drawings, we integrate them into GIS in a timely manner so that those assets can become part of the underlying GIS database. Condition assessment is an ongoing cycle. We're moving forward wherever we can to get a better handle on what the condition is of our assets. And then the other areas, the capital improvement, planning integration, the funding mechanisms, the maintenance, and the reporting, we're making headway in certain areas on those, but what those really feed into is a larger asset management software platform is really what the city is in need of, because those functions are built into those platforms that are offered. I'll speak a little bit more on that in the next couple of slides. So going back to GIS quickly, it's an integral part of what we're doing with asset management. We're building asset management out of GIS, and it makes sense that we're doing that. We just completed an update of our GIS strategic plan the first quarter of this year. Two big recommendations from that really feed right into asset management is, one, the development of our enterprise asset management roadmap, which again, that leans toward a comprehensive software platform for asset management, and then also further leveraging our mobile GIS solutions for doing things like those condition inventories. So here's an example of one that we've actually deployed as of the end of 2017. This is for doing manhole inspections. So we talked about the CCTV. That's more the pipes themselves. These are the manholes. So this is a mobile application that's out there right now that's being used by crews. They can pop a manhole lid. They can do measurements. They can see the condition of the manhole itself and log it into this application, and the supervisor or the project manager back in the office in real time can see the results of the condition assessments or the inspections in a dashboard. So that's something that we actually have out there right now. This is an example template of a sign inventory application. So our GIS vendor provides a lot of these types of tools that we can kind of off the shelf grab and deploy fairly easily. So that's kind of the next step for us, is to go through these different areas for asset inventorying that we can grab solutions that are available already and get them out there very quickly and start building up our inventory and our condition assessment. I've also been involved in trying to build regional cooperation with asset management. In fact, in December, we had the first meeting of the Northern Nevada Asset Management User Group. So several of us that are involved in asset management around the region got together, and it's been a great group for trading ideas, seeing where everybody's at as far as their own asset management implementation. You can see from the list of agencies involved, some of them have solutions they've selected, they're implementing. Others are more like us, where we're still evaluating where we're going to go with a platform for asset management. Okay, asset management software. So we've done quite a bit of research at this point on asset management software, what platform we want to head toward. Smartsheet's a great tool. It's not an asset management software. It's like the difference between Excel and our ERP system. So we really need to be moving as a city toward a comprehensive asset management, infrastructure asset management solution. Our new ERP solution through Tyler, they just recently released an asset management module. So we certainly want to evaluate the capabilities of that system, whether it's going to be appropriate, but we don't want to necessarily, pin ourselves in on something that may not be the right fit for us. There's big asset management solutions out there, things like CityWorks, Acela. These are multi-$100,000 software solutions, but they do everything. There's best-in-breed solutions that may do facilities management very well. They may do fleet management very well. So they're less expensive, but you would have to clump together several solutions to make a complete solution for asset management. So we had an objective of the next fiscal year to go out and work with consultants, somebody who's really an expert in that field, to identify our needs and build the requirements and start crafting requests for information and eventually an RFP. We didn't get funding for that, so we'll try to work around that the best we can through the next fiscal year, but that is something that we would like to have on the horizon for us to move forward with a comprehensive asset management platform. And then last but not least, we can't discount the employee resources that are required to support asset management. Right now, our asset management initiatives are being funded out of the GIS budget. We have 2 professional services consultants that we work with that provide about 1.5 FTE to support GIS and asset management needs. We had an objective for the next fiscal year to hire a full-time GIS technician. That funding didn't come through, so we're going to have to be creative in the ways that we're shifting our tasks with our consultants, the way I utilize my time, so that we're still pushing forward on the larger asset management initiative, but meeting the day-to-day needs for GIS support within the city. So we have to make sure that we keep that in consideration as we move forward with asset management, that there are going to be specific funding needs and staff needs for supporting that program. And with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
I'll just comment.
Sure.
I really wanted to bring this forward because at a prior meeting, one of the discussions was, are we not going to do performance-based budgeting? Are we moving away from things? And I think this really was the Board of Supervisors' first step in actually tying our CIP decisions and things to data so that we're making data-driven decisions. And I thought it was important for this committee to see that the board does take recommendations seriously, and certainly performance-based or at least data-driven reality. Why are we moving in this direction, or why are we putting the money to this? Why is the next resource going to be a GIS specialist maybe? Where are we going and why? So I just thought it would be interesting for you guys to see an actual program that we're implementing at the city level, and it, I think, crosses all of our departments in some way. So I think we're on the right path. I'm not sure we're at 100% implementation yet, but again, nothing happens in government overnight.
No, it was very helpful, so
That's cool.
that gives a different
They're doing a
perspective
great
on all the stuff you guys are working on, so appreciate the time and presentation. It's very informative.
And I did want to add, our city engineer, Dan Stuckey, did show up today, so.
Sorry, I was at the leadership class today and I couldn't miss it, so glad to be here. But Matt and Stephanie, they're the real ones behind this program, and they're doing a great job pushing it forward as best we can, so.
Yeah, good work. Thanks for showing up, guys. Appreciate it. All right. Public comment. The public is invited at this time to comment on any matter that is not specifically included on the agenda as an action item. No action may be taken on the matter raised under this item on of the agenda. Any public comment? I don't think we have any public here. And with that, we need to talk about the next meeting, which is always a great debate.
I think we have a meeting in June.
We do.
We do.
That was in the board program.
Right.
If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to suggest June 12th or June 26th.
I can do either.
June
12th is fine for me.
12th is better for me than 26th.
12th work? Yep.
Yeah, let's do the 12th.
Okay, thank you.
Are we doing it 2 o'clock?
Before we solidify that, we need to check the room calendar. I'm trying to pull it up here on my phone.
On Smartsheet? No, kidding. We have Smartsheet and Power BI too, so.
And I think we're looking at 3 o'clock time, correct?
2 or 3. He's checking the,
Yeah.
Well, I'm checking the city calendar, but we'll need to confirm with the scheduling people for this room. So, let's say all upcoming. Right now, there doesn't appear anything on the 12th to be on the city calendar, so I will confirm
primary.
that.
but they'll use the main room for the primary election, right? Isn't June 12th voting day?
Yes, it is.
It is, but they don't use this room, right?
No, it's all
Right. I'm at staff, don't have any staging or any, right?
So June 12th, 3 o'clock?
Tentatively, okay.
Yep.
What's that?
All right. That wasn't too painful. All right, with that, we are adjourned. Thanks for attending.